Questions that have regularly cropped up in the archives and at the museum over these last several decades have been about penciled drafts of three impassioned letters addressed to a master, letters with no other name addressee. So the questions: for whom were they intended? Did they signify a failed romantic relationship, an existential crisis, something else? Generally, it's been thought that they're an autobiographical record of sorts, pointing to some specific unknown event in Emily Dickinson's life. And speculation about the identity of the master accelerated over the years. One count of possibilities numbered around 15 different ones. And among the various male and female candidates, there were also God, nobody, and Emily Dickinson herself. It became one of the unknowns about Dickinson that helped to reinforce mystique and an image in popular imagination as an isolated, eccentric, and perhaps a little helpless individual. In her new work, Marta Werner has taken a wholly different approach to the biographical by considering these and other manuscripts as textual productions embedded by Dickinson in a larger project to form her own poetics, genre, and voice. That work aligns so perfectly with the purposes of the college archives and special collections and of the Emily Dickinson Museum. And that's why it's such a pleasure to talk with Marta Werner, professor of textual studies at Loyola University Chicago, and Mike Kelly, head of archives and special collections at Amherst College. So each of us will say a little bit about what we do and its connection to this project. And I'll just ask Marta to begin.
Thank you so much, Jane. And thank you, Kim, for putting this together, and Hannah and Beth, of course. And of course, Mike, who I have known for almost as long as I've been going to the archives, although I am older than he is. So I'm Marta Werner, and I teach textual studies and manuscript studies, and also 19th century poetry at Loyola University in Chicago. And it's a very, very special pleasure to be almost in Amherst tonight, because although I did not go to Amherst as a student, I do believe that my most vivid and abiding scholarly life has unfolded here, and specifically in the archives and in the museum. It's been over 30 years, I hate to say it in a way, but 30 years since I first came to the archives. And every year since then, I've returned to mine this seemingly infinite collection. The historian Arlette Farge has described the archive as a spring tide and a forest without clearings. And this describes how I have experienced the Dickinson archive at Amherst. It's immersive, it's disorienting, and it's radically renewing. So since I'm a textual editor and editing often gets a bad name, I wanted to just say a couple of words about what that practice means to me. And of course, its origins are in the archive, and it's an interpretation, right? It's a critical interpretation of archival materials. But from my perspective, editorial work has another dimension too. And that's that it is, for me at least, a kind of devotional exercise. It's love's work, because love is a kind of thing that helps us build our capacity to engage in Dickinson's text world, even though we know she is never going to write back to us, right? We're never going to get a direct response. But a very mysterious thing happens when you edit a text. You train yourself to follow the writer you're working on so closely that at times it's almost like your hand is moved over the pages by the writer herself, by the gait of her thought. But in the wake of this process, when you step back to look at the work from the distance, you often feel a very intense sense of estrangement, as if all that tracking you had done in a waking trance. everything looks veiled again. The documents are full of light, but they're also light years away. And I'd say that's the enigma of editing. That's the gift. Right? It turns the editor back into a reader, an ordinary reader, by which I mean also a lover. I know these works almost by heart. I don't know these works at all. And that is their summons to me, and I hope also to all of us. I'll turn it over to Mike.
Excellent. Thank you, Marta. Thank you, everyone, for putting this this event together. It's really wonderful to have a chance to talk about this book and to talk with Marta Werner tonight. I'm Mike Kelly. I'm the head of the Archives and Special Collections at Amherst College. I started at Amherst 12 years ago, just as Marta and Jen Bervin were finishing up work on this fantastic book, The Gorgeous Nothings. And working with them in the finishing stages of that project was a big part of my introduction to the archives at Amherst College, as I was getting to know my way around the Dickinson collection. And I really appreciate the way that Marta Werner appreciates what happens in an archives, that it is this messy space, and it is also a space of contemplation. And, you know, I find over time you get to know the materials in different ways. And so one of the biggest things that we're trying to do, and I'll talk about this in detail a little later on, is exactly in sync with what Marta Werner is talking about here, is how can we strip back some of these layers of interpretation that have built up on these documents over time and really get back to what do we know, what do we speculate about. And so it's really, we have so much to talk about, I don't want to take much time, so it's really wonderful to be here. And I will pass this along to Jane to get us going.
Okay, thanks, Mike. Thank you so much, Marta and Mike. So I'll just say just a couple of words about the Emily Dickinson Museum. I'm sure that for some in the audience, the term Emily Dickinson Museum may be less familiar than Dickinson Homestead or Emily Dickinson House. And that's because the college has owned the Dickinson Homestead since 1965, but it was only in 2003 that the Evergreens next door, the home of Emily's brother and sister-in-law, Austin and Susan Dickinson, was transferred to the college so that the two adjacent historic Dickinson family homes could be united and operated as a single literary site. And I guess I could say that I've been with the Emily Dickinson for now almost 21 of its 18 years, which is to say that I started life with the Dickinson homes before the merger occurred. And I guess I could say as an historic site, the houses and the landscape and the collections truly vividly illustrate the context of 19th century life in what was semi-rural Massachusetts, and more significantly, they serve as vital three-dimensional documents, if you will. They hold and trace the imprint of Emily Dickinson's daily life, scenes of writing, and at least some of the sources of inspiration for her. And just as the archives and special collections are the repository and researchers' resource for manuscript objects, the Emily Dickinson Museum's homestead is a point of origin for the manuscripts, and the Evergreens is a locus of their afterlife. So, Marta, could you tell us more about these master documents? You know, what exactly are they in your view? To be more precise, for, you know, as I said, for decades, they've been thought of as a grouping of three letters. How did you sift through them, and how did you come to sort of recollect the master documents?
Thank you so much for that question. It's a wonderful question, and it's a question that I think applies to almost every document Dickinson wrote. I first encountered the master letters, as they were called, in Johnson's 1958 letters, right? The first scholarly edition in which those documents appeared. And so, of course, like it was a scholarly edition. I assumed that everything in that scholarly edition represented those documents accurately. But then I went to the archives, right? And as archives almost always do, right? Archives show us that, that things are not always what they seem. And so these documents, right, these documents that had been referred to as letters, right, that had been positioned as correspondence, they weren't that at all. Right? Or if they started out as that, they soon became something very, very different. So, and the focus had to change, right? So instead of thinking about who the master was, right, as Jane said, I love this, that there were 15 different candidates. But in the end, right, nobody really emerged, right? There was never any satisfying proof that this of the identity of the master. What's also interesting, though, is that there wasn't any satisfying proof of their identity as documents. Right? So I think two things really kind of altered how we understand them in a deceptive way. Right? They are not to a particular, or they may be, but we do not know to whom they are addressed, and they are certainly not correspondence. Right? These are documents that that remained in the archive from 1858, the spring of 1858, into the spring of 1886 when Dickinson died. They were not sent out. And so to begin to understand them, right, is to understand them, first of all, as private documents, as archival documents, and to look at them instead of correspondence, but to see what else they might be. And I think it might be easiest for me to kind of show you a little bit of what they are. So I'm going to try to share my screen here and give you a couple of examples. So what you're seeing right here is the first page of the first earliest of these documents. And it starts out as a fair copy, and it looks like a fair copy letter, right? Because it has Dear Master, it begins Dear Master. But if we were to go on in this letter, if we were to read it aloud, we would soon discover that this letter scans as perfect verse, absolutely perfect verse, which is rather interesting for a letter. We'd also discover that there was no signature at the end. It's folded, right, as letters might be when they're intended to be sent, but there's no address anywhere, anywhere there. And if we look, we then go to the second one, we can see, and this is the first page of the second document, we see that there's no address at all, right? So the address to the master is, if anywhere, it's interior. This document begins in medias res. It's a pencil draft. There's crossouts all over. So certainly not something that would have been sent. And then we get to the third document. And this document is maybe my favorite, and we'll come back to it. It begins as, again, maybe as a letter, but it moves between poetry and prose and poetry and prose almost seamlessly. And it's also, as you can sort of begin to tell on this first page, and as we'll see later, it's a palimpsest. It was written on 2 occasions. Right, so a first occasion where Dickinson is writing fluidly in ink, and then a second occasion where she goes back and writes in pencil. But again, right, never sent. When I was thinking about this constellation, though, I was thinking about what made these documents a constellation. Right? Why did we call those 3 documents the master letters? And I think that, right, in the past, they were called that because of the addressee, or the presumed addressee. But really, they had other things that were, I think, much more important in common. They had material characteristics in common. They were all unbound, right? None of these documents were ever bound into vesicles. None of them were sent or circulated. And as I began to think about what else might enter this constellation, I found 2 poems, right? Mute Thy Coronation and A Wife at Daybreak, that also had those same material conditions. and fit into the same date range of 1858 to 1861. And I thought they needed to become part of this constellation for many reasons, but maybe first of all, to break our sense of this trinity, right? This kind of holy trinity of three letters, but also to see what Dickinson is doing, the fullness of this very early experiment. She's moving between prose and verse in the individual documents, but then she is also potentially adding verse. So when Dickinson begins, right, she begins the master documents before she's ever composed a fascicle, right? And at that point, right, at that very critical juncture, she has not decided, right, on what the privileged genre will be. Right? She is moving between these genres, not thinking of the divisions between poetry and prose, but thinking about what writing does, right? And how these forms of writing can move together. It's an extraordinary, really, I think, an extraordinary thing to think about where these documents fall in her work. Right? They begin at the very edge. Spring 1858, in summer 1858, she will copy and bind the first fascicle. The project ends in late 1861. And that is not an incidental date either, because it's at that moment that the fascicle structure is really, has really kind of moved into its own, and it's changing too. It is becoming a much more flexible structure, a much more workshop-like structure. And it's also a place where Dickinson is experimenting very, very radically with variant readings and with questions of identity and the non-identity of poems with themselves. I think that the master documents, as the first part of this constellation, can end in 1861 because the dynamics of the project, right, have been incorporated into the fascicles themselves and into the correspondences that are arising alongside of them, where there is tremendous experimentation and tremendous fluidity in terms of genre. But I'll say one more thing about the documents as a constellation, because I do think, I alluded to it earlier, but I think it's important to underscore it. These documents were not saved by accident. Right? Dickinson went through her materials, especially the early materials, over and over, and she purged things from the archive that she did not want to have. And we can know that because of the fact that there are hardly any drafts, right? Hardly any drafts at all from the 1850s, late 1850s and early 1860s. These documents are different. They were saved in this very particular draft-like and private state, and they were saved deliberately. And because of that, I think they were saved for us. And I don't mean that in a personal way, but in the sense that they were saved in order that we might encounter them in this time, in our moment, and try to grapple with them a bit.
Thanks so much, Marta. That's the kind of temporality and structural transition is just so fascinating, and it's I'm not sure something that, well, certainly not something that's been highlighted terribly. And Emily Dickinson's own archival manipulations, and considering that a number of other Dickinson manuscripts suffered erasures and obliterations and excisions by others, this collection is really quite remarkable and meaningful. I wonder if you could read one of the documents for us, perhaps your favorite. What in fact does it mean in its own time and to us now?
Well, I think we should read the document together, right? Because if there's one thing about these documents that is so fascinating, well, many things, right? But one of the things that is wonderful about them is how many voices appear in them, right? And how many addressees appear in them. And so maybe it would be, I'll give a brief preface to this document and then we can read it. In my view, and in Ralph Franklin's view, who edited these documents before me, the one that is my favorite is the final epistolary document, and I just call it A828, which is its archival number. And since we're focusing right on the material and the archival, we'll give it that name. To me, it's the one that is the palimpsest, right? It's the document that was composed on more than one occasion. But it's written probably, at least the first iteration of it, in the summer or the fall of 1861. And I'll just say a couple of words about its material body, because it is such a beautiful material body. It's written on 2 sheets of cream blue ruled stationery, and that stationery is embossed with a decorative frame holding the Queen's head. And many years ago, Susan Howe, the poet, discovered this and thought about this as a way of almost a kind of postmark on the document. And I agree, right? There's something about that, the choice of stationery that is part of the intention, right? Part of Dickinson's intentionality in this document. In the work that precedes this one, right? In the I don't want to call it a letter, but in the experiment that precedes this last document, there's been some kind of a breakdown. This is the document where you see that begins in medias res, it's in pencil. And the speaker alludes to a kind of trial there without giving it a particular name, but a trial that is so intense, right? A loss that is so profound that it threatened to really deprive her of language. So when we move from that document into this one, what we see too is Dickinson and Dickinson's speaker restored to the fullness of language and power, and also able to give an extraordinarily beautiful and exacting description of the beauty of the world. Right? So I think of this as a kind of apotheosis, right? And as a document in which Dickinson really comes back fully into the world. When she writes this work, Dickinson is 31 years old. She is just 31. And although only a few years have passed since she wrote the first one in 1858, the distance between that early document and this one feels infinite. The progress that she has made as a writer is simply exceptional. She retraces in these leaves the whole course of love, whatever that love is for, whether it is a person or writing itself. And there's an incredible kind of rhythmic variation of temporal zones, human and deep historical and cosmic. And in this rhythm, the writer and the addressee collide, and then they spin light years away from one another. She's zooming in and out of time in this document. And it gets registered, right, in these changes of scale. So she talks about love staking its claims in Pompeii, right, and in the house of the Plantagenet, but then very, very close, right, in a meadow in Amherst and in the Bobolinks Vespers. This document, I'm going to just share my screen so you can see it, so we can actually see this transformation here. Here we are on the first page. But we can see that when we get to the second page, look at that commotion, right? Look at where that commotion really begins. And Dickinson starts to reimagine the direction of this document. So if we imagine this document coming out of, right, kind of following the preceding document of trial and the loss of language, now Dickinson is going back and she's revising away from that vision of loss into a scene of almost what I would say vision and power. And I think it's not by accident that Dickinson begins at this point to cross out all of the materials about redemption. Right? She's not interested in redemption anymore. Right? She said, and I'm not sure if you can read the screen there, but she says, I heard of a thing called redemption, which rested men and women. You remember I asked you for it. You gave me something else. I forgot the redemption and was tired no more. At that juncture, the whole course of Dickinson's thought changes. And instead of writing a letter to an individual beloved person in the world, she begins to think about the power of language to renovate and re-astonish the world, and particularly the power of poetry. So in that second kind of return to the text, all of redemption is traded for the grace of writing in eternity, I think. And that early image of the bird, right, being hit by a bullet and killed, is renovated until we get to this extraordinary, which I can't see because we're kind of here. I'm going to try to move the screen there. This extraordinary image of a bird that is no bird, but rode in ether. It's such an incredibly moving text. And I think it's moving because it's exorbitant. It's such an exorbitant expression of a conversion. And it's also at the same time so absolutely hermetic. So I'm hoping we can read it, and maybe I'll try to go back and kind of move as we move through the pages, so the people here can actually see this document unfolding, and maybe we'll read kind of page by page.
Mm-hmm.
That's good.
All right. Anyone want to start?
I want to start because you need to do the second page. You need to read the second page.
All right, I'll read the second page.
All right, all right, I will start. Master, if you saw a bullet hit a bird and he told you he wasn't shot, you might weep at his courtesy, but you would certainly doubt his word. One drop more from the gash that stains your daisy's bosom, then would you believe Thomas's faith in anatomy was stronger than his faith in faith? God made me, master. I didn't be myself. I don't know how it was done. He built the heart in me. By and by it outgrew me. And like the little mother with the big child, I got tired holding him. I heard of a thing called redemption, which rested men and women.
You remember, I asked you for it. You gave me something else. I forgot the redemption in the redeemed. I didn't tell you for a long time, but I knew you had altered me, and I was tired no more. So dear did this stranger become that were it or my breath the alternative, I had tossed the fellow away with a smile. I am older tonight, master, but the love is the same. So are the moon and the crescent. If it had been God's will that I might breathe where you breathed and find the place myself at night, if I can never forget that I am not with you and that sorrow and frost are nearer than I, if I wish with a might I cannot repress that mine with the queen's place, the love of the Plantagenet is my only apology. To come nearer than presbyteries and nearer than the new coat that the tailor made, the prank of the heart at play on the heart in holy holiday is forbidden me. You make me say it over. I fear you laugh when I do not see, but Chillon is not funny. Have you the heart in your breast, sir? Is it set like mine a little to the left? Has it the misgiving if it wake in the night? Perchance itself to it, a timbrel is it, itself to it a tune. These things are reverent, holy, sir. I touch them reverently, hallowed, but
Persons who pray dare remark, Our Father. You say, I do not tell you all. Daisy confessed and denied not. Vesuvius don't talk. Etna don't. They said a syllable, one of them, 1,000 years ago, and Pompeii heard it and hid forever. She couldn't look the world in the face afterward, I suppose. Bashful Pompeii. tell you of the want. You know what a leech is, don't you? And remember that Daisy's arm is small, and you have felt the horizon, haven't you? And did the sea never come so close as to make you dance? I don't know what you can do for it. Thank you, Master.
But if I had the beard on my cheek like you, and you had Daisy's petals, and you cared so for me, what would become of you? Could you forget me in fight or flight or the foreign land? Couldn't Carlo and you and I walk in the meadows an hour and nobody care about the bobolink and his a silver scruple? I used to think when I died, I could see you. So I died as fast as I could. But the corporation are going heaven too. So eternity won't be sequestered now at all. Say I may wait for you. Say I need to go with no stranger to thee, to me. Untried fold, country, I waited a long time, Master, but I can wait more. Wait till my hazel hair is dappled.
And you carry the cane, and then I can look at my watch, and if the day is too far declined, we can take the chances for of heaven. What would you do with me if I came in white? Have you the little chest to put the alive in? I want to see you more, sir, than all I wish for in this world, and the wish, altered a little, will be my only one for the skies. Could you come to New England this summer? Would you come to Amherst? Would you like to come, Master? Would it do harm? Yet we both fear God. Would Daisy disappoint you? No, she wouldn't, sir. It were comfort forever just to look in your face while you looked in mine. Then I could play in the woods till dark, till you take me where sundown cannot find us, and the true keep coming till the town is full. Will you tell me if you will? I didn't think to tell you. You didn't come to me in white, nor ever told me why. No rose, yet felt myself a bloom. No bird, yet rode in ether.
Thank you, Mike and Marta. Sharing that reading was just so great. And from those golden soaring words, may we return to the archive, Mike? And I wonder if you could talk a little about how these master documents show up among the master manuscript collections, and how they've been regarded, handled, defined, or redefined.
Yeah, no, happy to. Actually, I need my glasses on again. I really love the way that Marta introduced that piece as a 828, and that's how I know where things are in what box when a scholar comes in and they say, I want to, those are the Amherst manuscript numbers. But I want to back up on that a second. And one of the things, there's a bit in the preface to Writing in Time where Marta writes, the edition's form is material and philological. It does not proceed against the grain of previous speculation, but against speculation itself and the overdetermination of the document's critical history and interpretation. And I think something that this book does beautifully is summarize a lot of that, the physical chain of possession, and sort of the early arguments and personalities involved in basically dripping out Dickinson's material archives from manuscripts over almost a century, right? From the time of her death in 1886, we get Mabel Loomis Todd's first edition of the poems coming out in 1890, and the Todds and the Bianchis and both sides, both houses are doling out their treasure trove of manuscripts one bit at a time. And that's a wonderful summary of that history is in the front matter to this volume. But that's exactly what we are working to undo in our current treatment of the Emily Dickinson manuscripts at Amherst College. So first of all, we have put into Amherst College Digital Collections, acdc.amherst.edu, every piece of paper in the archive that we know belonged to Emily Dickinson and she wrote something on. So yeah, thank you. There's a link in the chat that you can, that is what you would get if you search for the word master in Amherst College Digital Collections, Emily Dickinson collection, and those would come up. And what we love about how ACDC currently works, one of my favorite features, is that it displays thumbnails. And I often talk about how no scholar in the history of Dickinson scholarship that I know of has ever been allowed to spread every single Emily Dickinson manuscript out on a table and just scroll through them. But that's what this technology enables. And so as early as I think it was 2012 was when we finally put full color images of all of the Dickinson manuscripts at Amherst College up online for free, totally open access. The same principle behind the Amherst College Press, right? That Amherst College can give this scholarship away for the betterment of humanity. We believe in the humanities here. And so open access publishing of scholarship of the caliber of Marta Werner's is something that we can give back. And in the same way that we put the manuscripts up online, we've tried to peel back some of those layers of interpretation and really present them as this is an object. One small example of how I do that is when I talk to groups about Dickinson manuscripts in the outline of the Dickinson collection at Amherst, I don't talk about the number of poems we have and the number of letters we have. I soon realized that that was just insane because of, as Marta Werner points out, this transcendence of genre or defiance of expectations of genre. It looks like a letter, but is it a letter? And so the way that we talk about them in the archives and special collections is as manuscript objects, a phrase that Jane used when she was talking a bit ago. And so we have 850 discrete manuscript objects. Some of them are the size of a postage stamp with one little phrase. Some of them are fascicles that contain, upward of 30 poems. And so we've really done our best to, in the way we present them and describe them, is to back away from saying, this is the cluster known as, these are the three precious master letters, so getting away from that. And frankly, enabling people to read a piece of secondary scholarship that could have come out from whenever, and then actually look those manuscript images up at Amherst. And one other bit that I want to say before moving on, because there's so much more exciting things to talk about than listening to me, is, in that piece that we just read, the mentions of Pompeii, right, and Vesuvius, that is also tied to the Amherst College archives because we hold the papers of President Edward Hitchcock, who gave lectures on geology, who gave lectures on volcanology. What Dickinson knew about geology and science, she learned from attending lectures at Amherst College. And so we have the documents from Edward Hitchcock's lectures. Much of that material is available through ACDC. You can look at Ora White Hitchcock's illustrations of volcanoes that were displayed in Edward Hitchcock's classroom that were certainly known to Emily Dickinson. And so that's, and the other fabulous thing in Writing in Time is the weather records. Professor Snell kept meteorological records for a very long time. So we can tell you what the weather in Amherst was on pretty much any particular day in the mid to late 19th century. So there are many ways that Marta Werner's work really draws on the fullness of the archives. And I'm just going to stop right there because there's going to be a lot of great questions and there's much more to talk about. So Jane.
Yeah, thanks, Mike. This emphasis on collections and evidence and the material object and the manuscript object is I think, so interesting and sort of comes into its own. It's always kind of united in archives and special collections, which have both kinds of objects. And, thinking about your wonderful collection, and then just a couple of blocks away are the Homestead and the Evergreens, which present other kinds of evidence and convey sort of similar or a range of other emotional attachments, because the importance of place, the importance of sort of the object is indisputable. And to many, the homestead represents this kind of physical touchstone to Dickinson as a poet, where presence, in some sense, is thought to impart understanding, at least among audiences that come to the Emily Dickinson Museum. And many who come in person and increasingly virtually this past year do do that for kind of imaginative observation, inspiration from, or even reenactment of trying to approximate Dickinson's thinking and writing in the very place where she performed it. And thinking about, the space that's most representative of Dickinson's writing life, her bedroom, is considered the heart of the house and the ultimate destination for modern visitors, where there can be this kind of visceral experience of the author's scene of writing, the room, the furnishings, the decor, the writing used surfaces and utensils, the viewscape, the sound, smells, the train whistle, and even sort of the temperature. I mean, they're these magnetic markers of a real literary genius. But without, there's sometimes this question about restoration, preservation. What is it that we do with? And I think that's probably more for another time. But it does become, both the homestead and the evergreens do kind of retain patinas of the past and recoverable evidence of what those spaces looked like and how they operated during Dickinson's time. And that can be meaningful to many people who are really interested in this kind of sort of embodiment, enfleshment, incarnate nature of Emily Dickinson, who has seemed to be so remote and elusive, remains remote and elusive, but sure, you can get close to her, you can go into her house. And I'll just mention before we turn to questions is that the homestead this year is going to remain closed even after COVID restrictions are lifted, so that we can do a major restoration of the original main block of the house, the 1813 block that Emily Dickinson's grandfather built, so that there will be a coherent experience of the house that would be in sync with how Emily Dickinson herself experienced it. So I will stop there, and maybe we can turn to take some questions from the audience. And there is one from Marta, reflecting on your comments about the act of editing as a kind of reading. What kind of editor or reader do you think Emily Dickinson was?
Wow, that's a fantastic question. Thank you so much. One of the things that really strikes me about these documents and other documents in Dickinson's archive is how often she may have read them. Right? So when we think of these documents, especially, certainly we know with A828, right, that she wrote it and then she read it, because she had to read it, right, she had to approach it as a reader in order to do that kind of revision. And there are so many, particularly I think in the Amherst archive, that were written, let's say, maybe in the 1860s, and then very late, 10, 20 years later almost, she goes back and she's clearly going through her archive and reading, and she's revising. Right? So the sense of Dickinson as a reader, right? I get the sense of Dickinson as a reader is also always Dickinson as a writer, as a thinker, right? That she was constantly, and the document, right? The way that she understood a document was how a reader understands, right? As a living document, right? That is changing as you change, as you rethink things, as your life alters. And the evidence, right? The material evidence on the body of the text to suggest those changes is really astonishing. There's one manuscript at Amherst, and I can't, this is terrible, I can't remember the first line, but I remember the change that she makes in the document. And she changes the word thought to the word feel. And in that change, it seemed to me that was not an incidental change, right? She strikes the word thought out and then puts in large pencil letters, feel, as if she had her own whole process of relationship to thought and sensation and feeling had changed. And that's so much like the reader, right? I mean, so I always think of the reader and the writer as Dickinson is someone who was both things at the almost sometimes simultaneously, right? And her descriptions of reading are so wonderful too, right? When she talks about reading other people's materials, about how in some ways she sometimes reads from the back to the front, right? Because reading in the other direction would have just overturned her. So I think that sense of what she gets, what she does as a writer, right? She enacts these kinds of metamorphoses and transformations is also her experience as a reader. So very, very connected, very connected. It's a wonderful question, and someone should write a book about it.
Well, Marta, that makes me think of the George Gould invitation. The candy pulling invitation is such a great example of that, because it's an invitation she received 1850, and then on the back 25 years later composed, was it The Things That Never Can Come Back, or several, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Just, yeah, so many examples of that. I love it.
Yeah. Another question. I'm wondering, let's see, I'm wondering what each of you think about the identity of master. And I'm not asking whether you think it was a specific individual, but whether you think master was an abstraction or a real human being. Mike, why don't you start?
I'm convinced it's an abstraction. I'm convinced that she's, a passionate young woman who is writing, and comes up with a trope. And I'm really, this is just a fascinating way to look in these documents in a fresh way. I don't think we'll ever know. I don't know if I want to know. So, but yeah, I want to hear from Mark.
I think I eventually get to Mike's conclusion, but I think that, and it's a strange thing, and I know this sort of goes against the grain of critical thinking, but I have the feeling often that she had somebody, at least initially in mind, if we think of those documents as a kind of trajectory, that they begin as such documents do, with an actual person imagined. But then the documents take on, and the writing project takes on a life of its own. And so while there may be the idea, right, or the sort of origins in a particular person, she gets carried away by the writing, right, until she's not writing to a particular person at all, but to and through an idea. I think that there is something, right, there is something of what does it mean? I think there are incredible experiments in address. How do you address the beloved? And what does that mean, right? Who is that figure? And particularly because that figure is so elusive, and yet it is the very thing that makes you keep writing, right? Writing and writing. And so beginning perhaps with the imagination of an individual in the world, and then moving so that the address is multiple. And I think that's why we can receive them, right? Because in some ways, right, if they were to somebody absolutely particular, right, their mystery would be solved, but they're not, right? They're the way that we think about the other, right? The way that we are constantly looking, right? Imagining another, but then not writing to the thing that we wish. And it's always expanding. And I like the question, by the way. It's a wonderful question, because it's not really about, like, the particular identity of someone, but what is identity anyway, right? What does that mean when we say master? And we talk about the master letters, but Dickinson has other forms of address, right? She frequently calls that figure he, she calls that figure it, right, in one of the most sort of interesting formulations. And so you also get, right, this trajectory of something from it, right, the most almost inhuman manifestation of that identity, to master, to he, and then to physical descriptions even. So it's a really an amazing range of imagining what a being is.
Yeah, I'll throw my hat in the ring with abstraction also. And picking up on what you're saying about identity, Marta, is that the letters the documents can be read as acts of extreme introspection. And they are, from the language, it seems that they are coming up against something immovable, impenetrable, where the feelings, the thoughts, the emotions cycle back upon the writer. So it's been, trying to trace, compare and lay out timelines for if person A was here and this year and person B was there and that year. That's I think is just going to lead nowhere. And the idea of what who were Emily Dickinson's romantic interests, to me, is a separate question from the identity of this master. Let me see. I'd be interested to hear if there are other insights you feel you can confidently glean about Dickinson's life and writing practice from the materiality of some of the other documents beyond the letters. Are there any particular documents that stand out to you in this regard?
I think you can learn so much about writing practices from manuscripts. And one of the things I was thinking about when I was thinking about tonight was how I have simply stopped over time reading printed editions of Dickinson's work. And it's not because I don't think that there are some wonderful printed editions of Dickinson's work, but it's because the mediated form of print does erase to a certain extent, and sometimes to a very great extent, the dynamics of composition. So when you're looking at a manuscript, right, you can't know everything, right? Of course, and I wouldn't presume to imagine that you can even know in some very profound way what the authorial intention was, but you can follow a writing instrument across a paper, and you can see something of the trace of thought, right, of thinking. So I love to look at manuscripts with cancellations and to look at the kinds of cancellations, right? Because sometimes Dickinson writes, just a kind of single line through something. It's very reflective, it's very meditative. And sometimes she scribbles something out, right? And there's an energy there. And there's sometimes she'll take a word and she'll write that word over and over and over. There's a beautiful manuscript, As Summer into Autumn Slips. And at the end of that manuscript, she's trying to find the words to describe a ray of light. And she keeps coming back to this word shaft. And she writes it over and over and underlines it. And in that, there you have a little scene, right? You have a scene of somebody thinking of being unable to get past a word, maybe coming back to it. And you get a real sense of the rhythm of composition. And I think, it's interesting. Someone looking at Keats's manuscripts would see how absolutely almost flawless they are, right? I mean, there's not a mark on them. In Dickinson's, you see the struggle, right? You see that despite these incredible lyric throws, that there was an intense writing process going on, a trial, right? So often you get that sense of a trial. And what I love particularly is the way when you look at a rough draft and then you think of Dickinson copying, right? The difference between those moments. And then how when she's copying, so she's copying a fascicle page, but suddenly she's compelled back into a compositional mode, right? So that there's never a kind of I'm composing and then I'm copying, right? For Dickinson, there's always the possibility that even in the act of copying, she's going to be plummeted back into the compositional process because thought changes. And so it's amazing. And I would just say to anybody, right, that I thought I had read all of Dickinson's poems. And like many of you, probably most of you, I sat down, I read all 2,000 of them, and I thought, that's it, I know the whole oeuvre. Right? But most of them you don't remember. And then you'll read them in manuscript and you'll think, I never saw that poem before. Right? I never saw that. Because it comes alive. It's completely different.
It's a different reading every time.
Yeah. I want to throw into that too, that Dickinson had a really clear understanding of the expectations of print and the way that her own works could, the experience of, you know, a narrow fellow in the grass, you know, the snake appearing in the newspaper, but she kept going, right? And as she gets older, some of those later manuscripts, like Alone and in a Circumstance, are where the experiments, she just keeps going. She knows that is not something that could appear in print during her lifetime in a way that would satisfy her imagination. And so, yeah, that, I think, realizing why didn't she print, I think she just surpassed it in her own head and was like, yeah, I'm doing something different.
I think we have time for one more question. And there's one that, let me answer another question very quickly before we get to the last question. Someone asked about where the manuscripts were, that they're just a couple of blocks away from the homestead in the Evergreens, and the manuscripts are in archives and special collections in the Frost Library. For a last question, Marla, how are you thinking about the term master itself, with all the investment and hierarchies and servitude of that term, especially in the context of everything that you describe as liberating and exploratory in this experiment?
That's a really hard question. And just as an aside, I noticed that there's so many questions in the chat that we haven't had a chance to answer. And I would be delighted to try to answer them in writing if there's that possibility later. The charged term, master, is a very hard one to deal with, right? And I think particularly because it's historically charged, right? It's charged in terms of gender. And yet I think that Dickinson is addressing that term, right? So, and she takes that term master, right? And so in the first document, it's dear, master becomes part of the address. In the second document, she takes that address away and puts that and makes that address interior. And then she brings it back in the third document, but only when she has so mastered the master, right? And only when she has, in fact, right, performed an escape from the dialectics of mastery in that document, that the address becomes almost meaningless. Now, when I was doing this, I wanted to see, where are these masters, right? Where are they in Dickinson's work? And she almost always, with the exception of sometimes referring to a writing master as a teacher, she almost always confronts that very charged sense of the term. But she is also always renegotiating her own relationship to it.
Well, I said one more, but we'll take one more. And this question is, given the times and the possibility that her work would not be known or interpreted with some seriousness, was Dickinson prescient in placing clues in texts that would lead some future reader or scholar to realize the experimental quality of her work? Is her hand guiding us to the center of her accomplishment?
Yes. I actually think she was writing, I think she had an enormous confidence, right? Mm-hmm. Nobody could have written that number of works. Nobody could have experimented so profoundly without having a sense that that she was, that there was a risk, but it was worth taking, that this would somehow survive. Mm-hmm. And of course it did, and she knew it would. she knew it was going to.
And you highlight her own acts of saving, right? That she retained. What did she retain? And that's another one. We say that this is an invitation from 1850. She saved it for the rest of her life. We don't know what happened. Did they go on the date? But she saved it for the rest of her life. And that's why it's here.
This is adjacent to the question of her intention, her desire to publish either during her lifetime or posthumously. And that is connected to a question that the Emily Dickinson Museum, we, or at least I, continually ask myself is, what would she think of our being in her home this way? And I guess my own feeling is, thinking about all of her writing about fame and the various ways in which she examines that. I think that is a clue that she is giving us permission. Well, any parting thoughts, Mike or Marta?
Log on to ACDC and look at the stuff yourselves. That's the beauty of it. You can download it. You can examine it really close up. We need to redo all the photography. That is what the new photography that was done for this book has convinced me. It all has to be redone. And then who knows what we'll find.
I would just say, go to the archives. Go to the archives and go to the museum, because these spaces are so vital. Once you go to those places, you will never come out.
I haven't.
And thank you for drawing this marvelous work from those places. Thanks so much. Mike and Marta, this has really been a delightful conversation about writing in time, Emily Dickinson's Master Hours from Amherst College Press. In the chat, you've got information about how to acquire the book, and that'll be coming up on a slide pretty soon. I want to thank all our friends from Amherst College Press and alumni and parent programs for putting this wonderful evening together. This has just been a true delight. We're so glad that all of you online could join us. And we wish you, before we get to see you in Amherst again, we wish you a very good night.